All right, Mike. I had an editor once tell me never to start with a history lesson, but I'm just going to make you quickly introduce yourself and what you do, and then we'll get right into it.
Sure. So I am one of the two co-founders of Major League Gaming, one of the early pioneers in esports, kind of the first big esports league in North America. And then more recently, about a year ago, launched the Media Networks division as one of the new operating companies of Activision Blizzard to really capitalize on our rich history in the esports space and build out a really huge premium media network for esports content. And then late last year, we acquired Major League Gaming too. So now got the whole band back together and we're rocking.
It's all come back around.
Exactly.
So I like that we're really talking about a very specific topic today, how to make esports more mainstream. But I think before we kind of get into that, let's have you kind of set the goalposts. What does that even mean? What does it mean to make esports mainstream?
Sure. Well, I think it seems incongruous to talk about how big the viewership is and then say it's not mainstream.
That's right.
I think the real issue is, unlike many sports properties at their infancy, or even just general entertainment properties or new trends at their infancy, esports is one of the first kind of new entertainment properties, especially in the sports world, that's grown up completely outside of traditional distribution. So really no television at all, very little traditional media coverage. It's really been kind of this thing that grew on its own very organically, and therefore very tough from a discovery point of view for people who are not seeking out the content. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge audience, but it's a very sort of tapped in audience. It's a very big niche in a way. It's hundreds of millions of people globally who are essentially a niche because it's not being impacted or viewed by people not specifically interested in the content. So I think for me, mainstream means, how do you make it something that sort of everyone's aware of? We've done some research recently that shows that in the US, only about 15% of consumers are even aware of esports. But those 15% are probably watching hours of it every week. So that's sort of where we want to take it. So it becomes a household thing. So that it's up there. The superstars of the sport, the gamers that we want to promote and celebrate, are kind of stars, as are, major performing artists or athletes. And people are just generally aware of what esports is and how it works and why they should care about it.
Let's talk about the push and pull there. You mentioned this 15%, and they are highly engaged. We're on Twitch and YouTube gaming right now, and a lot of those are the people that are watching these things every single day, and they might be asking, I feel like we're probably good enough. You always talk about how big the audience is. Yeah. Do you really need someone who's not me? I'm here, I'm watching, and I have a disposable income. I'm a young person.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things is esports right now is lots of different games being played competitively. It's not one thing, right? So we make allusions to the NBA Finals or the Super Bowl and kind of how big those audiences are, and then we compare it to all of the aggregate global audience for every game in esports. So I think we've got a bunch of passionate core fans watching individual games that add up to a really big number. But we don't have that sort of mass appeal event that people are tuning in to just see one big thing. So I think that's a big part of what we need to do. And then I think, clearly the sport really originated in Asia, specifically in South Korea. It's spread across the world, sort of going into Europe and really sort of taking off in Europe over the past 5 years. And it's really still infantile in the US or North America in general, where we have a full dance card of entertainment options and sports options and a full season schedule and the big 4 sports leagues and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little tough to break into the quote unquote mainstream here. But I think when we do, we're starting to see major advertisers kind of key into this idea that, hey, if I want to get a young male millennial audience, I can't really find them watching sports on TV or traditional distribution channels. I really need to engage with something new that they're engaging with passionately. And to do that, I need to learn about a new sport. I need to learn about gaming and digital culture. I need to learn about all these new distribution channels. And I got to figure out how to make advertising native enough so it's not disruptive to that experience. So there's still a lot of work to do. I think the core audiences are great, and our job is to make sure that we're really entertaining and celebrating them, but also explaining the sport and building personalities to a much wider audience.
And what's it kind of look like if we kind of get to that point where in the US we get that other 85% involved and watching esports, or at least aware of it? Like you said, they're not even aware of it. What does that look like to you? What are you selling to these brands that you might be talking to today?
Well, look, I think from an advertiser's point of view, it's really tough to reach millennial males on television, right? So the biggest advertising channel in the world that's become mature over the past 75 years, that's a really important way to deliver creative and brand messages, is almost irrelevant to the whole next generation of male consumers.
Right.
And by the way, female consumers who are kind of the fastest growing fan base in esports now. So there's this whole thing that you're missing. The event that was referenced in our introduction, we did a Counter-Strike Go major in Columbus, your hometown.
That's right.
Back in April, and 45 million hours of video were watched live during that broadcast. It also happened to be going on during the Final Four March Madness basketball tournament. And so you had, literally tens of millions of people watching, 10,000 people in the room, not watching the Final Four games.
Making a very clear decision about where their interests lie.
Yeah, they were watching esports, not basketball, right? Not literally after the NBA Finals, the biggest basketball.
And that's something that brands,
year.
they hear that and they understand that very easily.
Yeah, it's like, hey, you're just literally missing tens of millions of people if you're not engaging with this content.
So that kind of begs the question, aren't we going to get to a point where that young demographic is just going to grow up, they're going to leave college, and they're going to have jobs where they have a lot more money, and they just are going to become the mainstream naturally?
Yeah.
Is there something we have to do beyond that to facilitate this process?
Well, I mean, obviously, we'd like to not wait. I've been in esports for 15 years. I don't want to wait another 10 for it to get big. So I think we have some urgency to kind of get out there. I think it's an educational process. I think digital distribution and digital consumption of video is not something unique to esports. It's happening in every form of entertainment, right? Netflix and Hulu and all these other things delivering premium content on a subscription basis, figuring out interesting ways to bring native advertising. Facebook has become a monster in video nearly overnight.
Yes.
I think that's proving to major brands that television is not really the future. Television is a current today way to reach a mass market with video creative and brand messaging, but it's not the future, clearly. And if you don't start getting educated about how digital video works and how content formats that are native to digital video like esports work, you're going to really miss out long term.
Well, let's talk about that. We just had a recent, Turner's got their E-League.
Sure.
It's on TBS on Friday nights.
Yep.
I mean, that's cable, it's TV, it's something brands can easily understand, right? So what's the problem there?
Yeah, I think it's proven that really, the hope of television execs, I think, is that the content will bring young millennial males back to cable television. It's not content that's specifically being made for the existing cable audience, and I think you kind of saw that in the numbers. I mean, E-League put out an announcement, I think, 2 days ago about their total viewership in minutes, but it translates to about 14.5, 15 million hours of consumption, which is, at the CSGO major in Columbus, we did that in one day. So they were
showing CSGO as well, so it's a one-to-one.
Yeah, it's a one-to-one thing. It was a lot of the same teams. In one day, we did the viewership that they did in 10 weeks of this inaugural season, combining Twitch viewership and television. So, it's not easy to jump into this game, and between the combination of Blizzard's rich history, in many ways kind of launching esports with StarCraft many years ago, and MLG's history in producing content for esports and designing and operating leagues, I think we're kind of way in the forefront. And then with titles like Call of Duty, such a big mainstream game that is really primarily played on an ongoing basis competitively amongst our core players, we just have a really interesting go-to-market strategy around all of that, and a very rich environment for advertisers to engage with.
So if cable's not necessarily the answer for the audience that we have or the audience that we're looking for,
Sure.
What is MLG doing? What are you guys doing specifically to make it more mainstream or just to grow it in general?
Yeah, so I think, in one respect, a really important thing is to move the production and distribution and sort of creation of esports as a sport and a media type out of being funded by marketing budgets of publishers and into becoming a business in and of itself, right? So we're doing a lot of work across all of our teams internally, and even with, even with other players in the industry to figure out how do you turn this into a real business. And sports, generally speaking, are driven by, broadcast rights fees, which is just a way to pass through advertising revenue, right? So ESPN's buying Monday Night Football rights from the NFL, they're selling advertising against it, and so that's a pass through in digital. It's ticketing and gate, it's merchandising, it's sponsorships, it's all of that sort of full plethora of revenue streams, and we're trying to really make sure that we are optimizing those when we're thinking about how we produce and distribute the content. And so, part of the challenge is obviously the consumer base has grown up expecting this content to be available everywhere they want it to be. I think the other day, my old friend Pierre Moore was on stage talking about kind of their strategy at EA for just widespread distribution. I think that works for now, and we've trained the consumer to expect that, so we have to kind of continue to do that. But we also have to figure out a way to monetize the content because it's very premium content. We're spending tens of millions of dollars producing the content, and you aren't really
Is there something of an arms race there where it's like you guys are making it better, other competitors are making it look better, so you have to keep spending more?
Yeah, I think, well, you don't have to necessarily spend more to make it look good. I think you just have to be really good at producing the content, and you have to think about it the right way. But I think the distribution side is what still needs work, because you can't, platforms like Twitch and YouTube are not necessarily made for premium content holders to spend a lot of money creating content and then distribute it across all those platforms. Like, you're not going to see Game of Thrones, for instance, and its production budgets be distributed on free UGC-generated platforms, right? You need a way to monetize that effectively. And so we've got to, as an industry, think through the challenge of how do we kind of get a lot of new consumers interested in the content? How do we get the core consumers to be okay with, maybe in the future some limited distribution where they can still see it everywhere, they'll be able to get it on their phone or on their console or their TV, frankly, but in a way that we can monetize it better so we can continue to reinvest in producing more and more content.
And you touched on this a little bit, but is one of those challenges also convincing companies that this isn't just about marketing? Clearly, Activision, MLG, showing CS:GO, like that's not marketing for Activision, right?
Right. Yeah, we're not building our core business that way. Although, we do continue to work, obviously, with our partners internally at Activision Publishing and Blizzard, and maybe even with King in the future. There's some really interesting mobile plays there. But yeah, our job as part of Activision Blizzard is to build, the premium destination for consuming esports content. And then as part of that, we're helping our internal teams build leagues and figure out new financial models for how do you build something that turns into a business so you can really reinvest deeply in it. We're working with traditional sports producers and directors to figure out how do we kind of take this core talent, these guys who are amazing at playing these games, and really turn them into superstars. Across the board, we're doing a lot of things like that we're borrowing from traditional, but we're really pushing new models.
And clearly, I don't think you have to convince anyone anymore at Activision that this is a good idea.
Right.
But you kind of had to get in that position in the first place.
Yeah.
What was that like? What was it like to be like, hey, no, this is a real thing that we need to be worried about?
Sure. It's been an interesting 12 or 14 years, however long it's been. So, originally we launched the MLG Pro Circuit without the rights to the games that we were running. And in fact, I did our first TV deal with NBC Sports for a USA series back in 2006. We actually had a TV distribution deal before we had the rights to the game that we were using. So there was an era
of sweaty lawyers.
Yeah, a lot of lawyers. There was a lot of ask forgiveness, not permission kind of thing as a startup that was being disruptive in the space. Interestingly, though, the video game industry was sort of the last to get on board in many ways. I think with specifically excluding Blizzard and that they've been in it longer than MLG was. But the rest of the industry took a long time to wake up. The first industry that embraced us was the sports industry and the sports television industry specifically. So, our first advisory board member was a guy named Neil Pilson, who was the president of CBS Sports for 20-something years. Now that we're launching this new division at Activision Blizzard, the chairman of the division is Steve Bornstein, who was the CEO of ESPN for all of the 90s and more, and launched the NFL Network. So people from the sports world have really seen, without any sort of background in video games or even understanding what competitive gaming is, really seen, okay, this is interesting storylines. You've got lots of people playing games, deeply engaged with it. It's competitive. The best players win. There's a big skill gap. We can make interesting stories, and we can produce this kind of content and distribute it and get advertisers excited about it too.
Well, that's interesting because to me it seems like if we look at a long run, if we look out the next century, contact sports may start losing some players, and then it might start losing viewers because fewer young people are playing.
Yeah.
You know, there's fears of brain damage, things like that.
Sure.
Clearly, esports can step in there. Do you get a sense when you talk to these guys from the sports world that they're aware of this possibility, and esports is a way to future-proof against that?
There is not a traditional sports league that we're not engaged in conversations with right now. All of them are interested, including not just the leagues and the commissioner's offices, but the team owners. All very, very interested in the future of esports and where its place will be in the overall traditional sports or sports media world. I think that, I think it's actually more about a sort of innovator's dilemma around digital versus traditional distribution. There's still, all of the big sports leagues are absolutely reliant on broadcast rights, which are reliant on exclusive television windows for distribution. And as we've just talked about for the first 15 minutes, there's a huge...
That next generation audience is not there
They
anymore.
don't have it. They're not even going to TBS to watch esports, right?
Yeah.
So I think in a lot of ways, it's just that they literally don't have cable. There's a huge portion of this audience that are not just cord cutters. They're like cord never hatters in the first place, or whatever. You guys probably have a good way to say that. I don't know how to say it.
No, that's good. But yeah, so what else is there where these people from the sports world sort of just kind of get it? Because it seems like if I were one of them, I'd be like, this is scary, and I would want to reject it.
Right.
But it seems like, because you also often hear like people say, oh, gaming's not a sport. That's
Yeah.
not, why is this on ESPN? But all the people in charge there, in charge of the money, in charge of the players, they seem to get it.
Yeah, I think, look, the business people get it. I think the TV people get it in the sports world. I think the athletes get it in the sports world. One of the secrets of the esports world is that many of our biggest fans are professional athletes in traditional sports, and they're all players and competitors themselves. I do think that they all they get it. I think one thing I actually agree very deeply with Peter about is the word esports it forces a debate over athleticism.
Yes. An unnecessary one.
An unnecessary one. It's never really mattered to us.
Yeah.
Like Peter, and I think we've had this conversation probably a decade ago. We never really liked the term esports. We'd prefer everyone just call it Major League Gaming.
Of course,
I think that
They
makes
don't?
the most of it.
Yeah,
That
they
makes
should,
sense to me. But yeah, no, I think it forces this debate over athleticism, which is kind of silly. Like, Formula One drivers are some of the highest paid athletes in the world.
Right.
They don't have to be super athletic
And
to
they're
do
using
that.
a controller.
Yeah, it's effectively a controller, right? I mean, some of my favorite pitchers in Yankees history are not exactly super athletes from they're not Usain Bolts or people like that. So I think the debate over athleticism is driven by the word esport more than it needs to be. And I think we should all kind of get past that. It doesn't really matter too much. Plenty of people watch golf. It's not the most athletic sport in the world, things like that.
So let's bring this home. We're trying to figure out how to make esports more mainstream. It sounds like you guys have a pretty good path to that, but is there something else that we haven't touched on that you'd be like, this is how we get to that plateau, this is how we get to that next ledge?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One, I would say that is sort of most people aren't clued into right away, that haven't been in the space for a long time, is there's a lot of focus on creating a pro league for every new competitive title that comes out. And I think one of the things that supports traditional sports, and that we've really, in my mind, kind of pioneered and perfected in the esports world with Major League Gaming, is you have to have a gigantic talent development system. It's really, when you look at a pro league, if you look at the NFL, that is the very tip of the iceberg in terms of people who are, if you go all the way back from Pop Warner through high school to college, the NCAA system, all that kind of stuff. If you think about basketball, it's even bigger, right? It's literally a global developmental system for talent just to get to 32 teams rosters in the professional sense. And that kind of gets skipped over a lot of times with the race to have everybody have a pro league in esports. So we spend a ton of time building out that bigger sanctioning system that really develops talent from the ground up. And I think the advantage that gaming has is participation is so high. We've got every male millennial essentially is playing some form of video game, and more playing it online and competitively. We can engage that entire system to create a great talent development system, and that then becomes your kind of core audience and your biggest evangelizers for the sport. So that's something we focus on heavily. The other side of it is just getting big brands and big advertising agencies comfortable with the content so that they feel like they're not being intrusive and they're being additive, and then we figuring out as an industry good ways to introduce that advertising so that we can drive significant revenue that we can then reinvest in creating more content.
Excellent. Mike, I think we're out of time, saying 8 seconds left, so we're going to say goodbye. Mike, thanks for talking with me. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Good to see you.
Yep.